In the grand tapestry of human history, there are moments where the thread snaps. These are not merely defeats or changes in administration, they are cataclysms that fundamentally alter the trajectory of civilization. We often look to the fall of Rome or the burning of the Library of Alexandria as the ultimate symbols of cultural loss. Yet there is a singular event in the 13th century that eclipses them both in terms of sheer brutality and the irrevocable destruction of knowledge. It was a moment when the intellectual center of the world, a city that had stood for half a millennium as a beacon of science, art, and philosophy, was not just conquered, but erased. This is the story of the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. It is the story of a ruler who believed himself the shadow of God on earth, only to find himself staring into the eyes of a man who considered himself the scourge of God. But beyond the slaughter of hundreds of thousands and the burning of libraries, the specific, intimate, and horrifying fate reserved for the royal family of Baghdad stands apart. It was a punishment designed to be more than an execution. It was a dismantling of the soul, a ritualistic humiliation, and a terrifying adherence to a code of honor that made death the least of the victim's worries. To understand the horror of the end, however, we must first understand the height from which the victims fell. Imagine, if you will, Baghdad in the middle of the 13th century. It was not merely a capital city, it was the navel of the world. For 500 years, the Abbasid caliphs had cultivated a metropolis that defied the limitations of its time. While Europe was struggling through the murky stagnation of the Dark Ages, the streets of Baghdad were paved and lit. Its hospitals were conducting surgeries and quarantining the sick in sterile wards. Its observatories were mapping the stars with a precision that would not be matched for centuries. At its heart lay the House of Wisdom, a library and academy that contained the sum total of human knowledge up to that point. Here, the works of Aristotle and Plato were translated, algebra was invented, and the foundations of modern medicine were laid. To be a citizen of Baghdad was to believe that civilization had reached its peak. It was a city of 1,000,000 souls, protected by high walls and the spiritual armor of the caliphate, an institution that commanded the loyalty of the entire Sunni Muslim world. Sitting atop this golden throne was Caliph al-Mustasim. In retrospect, history has not been kind to him, painting him as a man uniquely unsuited for the crisis that was approaching. He was a creature of the palace, soft-handed and arrogant, surrounded by sycophants who whispered sweet lies into his ears. He believed in the invincibility of his lineage. After all, the Abbasids had survived internal rebellions, crusades, and palace coups. They were the spiritual leaders of Islam, the successors to the Prophet. The idea that a pagan army from the distant steppes could threaten the city of peace seemed not just impossible, but blasphemous. This hubris was the first nail in his coffin. The caliph spent his days listening to music and his nights counting his vast treasures, ignoring the reports from the east that spoke of a gathering storm. He was advised by a vizier who many historians argue was treacherous, urging the caliph to disband a significant portion of his army to save money, assuring him that the name of the caliph alone was shield enough against the barbarians. But the storm gathering in the east cared nothing for titles or spiritual authority. The Mongols, under the leadership of the great Khans, had already swallowed China and Central Asia. Now a new directive had been issued by Manke Khan to his brother Hulagu. The mandate was simple and chillingly efficient: expand the empire to the borders of Egypt. Anyone who submitted would be spared and taxed. Anyone who resisted would be annihilated. Hulagu Khan was not a mindless savage. He was a sophisticated warlord leading the most advanced military machine the world had ever seen. His army was a composite force of Mongol cavalry, Chinese engineers, Christian allies from Georgia and Armenia, and Muslim conscripts who had already surrendered. It was a rolling city of death, numbering nearly 150,000 men, bringing with them siege engines capable of shattering the strongest fortifications known to man. Hulagu moved with a terrifying deliberation. Before he even turned his eyes toward Baghdad, he decided to eliminate the assassins, the secretive and deadly sect based in the mountain fortress of Alamut. For generations, the assassins had terrorized the Middle East, killing kings and viziers with impunity. They were thought to be untouchable in their eagles' nests high in the mountains. Hulagu crushed them in a matter of weeks. It was a message to the world: no walls are high enough, No reputation is scary enough to stop the Mongol advance. With the assassins destroyed, the road to Baghdad was open. Hulagu sent messengers to al-Mustasim, demanding his submission. He demanded that the caliph tear down the walls of Baghdad and come in person to the Mongol camp to pledge allegiance. The response from the caliph was a study in delusion. Instead of mobilizing every able-bodied man or sending his treasury to hire mercenaries, he sent a letter back to Hulagu that was filled with empty threats. He warned the Mongol warlord that if he attacked Baghdad, the entire Muslim world, from India to North Africa, would rise up and crush him. He called Hulagu young and ignorant. It was the letter of a man who did not understand that the rules of the world had changed. Hulagu, upon reading the insults, did not rage. He merely laughed. He noted that the caliph was like a man who strikes at the moon with his fist. The time for diplomacy was over. The Mongol war machine began to encircle the city. In January of 1258, the siege began. The caliph finally realized the gravity of his mistake, but it was far too late. He sent out a small force to confront the Mongol vanguard, but the Mongols simply broke the dikes of the Tigris River, flooding the camp of the Baghdad defenders. The caliph's soldiers were drowned in the mud or cut down as they tried to flee. Baghdad was now trapped. The Mongols, utilizing Chinese engineering, constructed a palisade around the entire city, sealing it off completely. No food could enter, no one could leave. Then the bombardment began. Great stones and pots of burning naphtha rained down on the city. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder that shook the foundations of the palaces and the mosques. The famous walls of Baghdad, neglected for years, began to crumble. Inside the city, panic turned to despair. The caliph, terrified and desperate, sent envoys to negotiate. He offered vast sums of gold. He offered to say the Frid, prayers in Hulagu's name. He offered anything to make the demons go away. But Hulagu refused to see the messengers. The time for negotiation had been months ago. Now was the time for judgment. The Mongol engineers mined under the walls, bringing down the towers. On the 10th of February, seeing that the end was inevitable, Caliph al-Mustasim made the decision to surrender. He hoped that, by throwing himself on the mercy of the Khan, he might save his life and the lives of his people. He walked out of the city gates, accompanied by his 3 sons and 3,000 of the city's dignitaries, judges, scholars, nobles, and courtiers. This moment, the surrender, is where the true horror begins. It was a deception of masterful cruelty. Hulagu received the caliph with a strange, eerie politeness. He did not kill him immediately. Instead, he asked the caliph to order the rest of the city's defenders to lay down their arms and come out of the city so that a census could be taken. The caliph, believing he had established a rapport with the conqueror, obeyed. The soldiers of Baghdad marched out unarmed. As they exited the gates, they were separated into small groups and slaughtered. Tens of thousands of men were cut down in silence, their bodies piled in heaps. The caliph watched, or perhaps he was kept away, but the betrayal was absolute. With the defenders gone, the Mongols entered the city on February 13th. What followed was a week of destruction that defies description. It was not just a looting, it was an extermination. The Mongols had a quota of heads to collect. Men, women, and children were butchered in the streets, in their homes, and in the mosques where they had fled for sanctuary. The great libraries, the pride of the Islamic world, were ransacked. The books, containing the wisdom of the ancients, were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said that there were so many books that a horse could walk across the river on them. The ink from the pages bled into the water, turning the river black, while the blood from the massacre turned it red. The House of Wisdom was burned to the ground. In 1 week, the accumulated knowledge of centuries was wiped out. The total death toll is impossible to verify, with estimates ranging from 200,000 to nearly 1 million. The stench of the dead became so overpowering that the Mongols eventually had to move their camp upwind to avoid disease. But amidst this apocalypse, Hulagu had a specific plan for the royal family. The treatment of al-Mustasim was crafted to serve as a lesson for all eternity. The caliph was brought before Hulagu, who had taken residence in the caliph's own palace. The Mongol warlord chided the caliph for his hoarding of wealth. He pointed to the vast treasury, rooms filled with gold ingots, precious stones and pearls, and asked a simple, terrifying question. If you had so much gold, why did you not use it to pay your soldiers? Why did you not use it to reinforce your walls? Did you think this metal would fight for you? The caliph, trembling, could offer no answer. He muttered that it was the will of God. Hulagu replied, "Then what happens to you now is also the will of God." There are several accounts of what happened next, each more harrowing than the last, but they all point to a specific Mongol superstition and a cruel irony. The Mongols believed that spilling royal blood upon the earth was a taboo that would bring bad luck and natural disasters. To kill a king, one had to do it without breaking the skin, without letting a drop of the sacred blood touch the ground. This belief, however, did not mean mercy. It meant a slower, more crushing form of death. One account, widely cited by historians like Marco Polo, tells of Hulagu locking the caliph in his own tray. Azari. The caliph was surrounded by the gold and silver he had loved so much, but he was given no food or water. When he cried out for hunger, Hulagu told him to eat his gold. "You gathered it, you guarded it, now enjoy it," the Khan is reported to have said. It was a psychological torture, forcing the caliph to realize the utter uselessness of material wealth in the face of raw power. He starved to death amidst the greatest fortune on earth, a king dying like a beggar in a tomb of his own making. However, the more prevalent and historically accepted narrative is far more brutal and active. After the caliph had been forced to watch the destruction of his city, after he had seen his daughters distributed as slaves to the Mongol commanders and his sons executed before his eyes, his own time came. To adhere to the law against spilling royal blood, the Mongols devised a method of execution that was both humiliating and horrifyingly effective. They took the caliph, the shadow of God on earth, and wrapped him tightly in a carpet. He was rolled up like a piece of baggage, completely immobilized, unable to move or see, muffled in the thick fabric of his own palace furnishings. Once he was secured in this woolen cocoon, the bundle was placed on the ground. Then, the Mongol cavalry was summoned. At a signal, the horses began to trample the carpet. It was not a quick death. It was a bludgeoning, a crushing of bones and organs under the iron-shod hooves of the horses. The caliph would have felt every impact, the cracking of his ribs, the crushing of his limbs, all while trapped in the suffocating darkness of the rug. It was a death of absolute helplessness. There was no dignity, no final words, no executioner's block where one could meet their end with a steady gaze. He was simply trampled into the dust, treated not as a human being, but as an obstruction on the road. The Mongo rode over him back and forth until the bundle ceased to move, until the man inside was nothing more than a broken mass. The earth remained clean of his blood, satisfying the Mongol superstition, but the brutality of the act sent a shockwave through the world that has never fully dissipated. The horror extended beyond the caliph. His sons were killed, save for one who was sent to Mongolia to live as a prisoner, eventually disappearing from history. The women of the royal household, women who had lived their entire lives behind veils and palace walls, never seen by the eyes of common men, were dragged out and divided like cattle among the troops. The lineage of the Abbasids, which had traced its bloodline back to the uncle of the Prophet, was effectively severed. The illusion of their divine protection was shattered not just by their defeat, but by the absolute contempt with which they were dismantled. This event, the rolling of the caliph in the carpet, signified more than just the death of a man. It was the death of an era. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was devastating. For the first time in history, there was no caliph. The chain of succession was broken. The symbol of unity was gone. Poets wrote elegies that sounded like the end of the world. They wrote that the Tigris would mourn for eternity, that the sun should hide its face in shame. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of the Islamic Golden Age. The center of power shifted to Cairo and later to Istanbul, but the intellectual vibrancy, the open inquiry, and the scientific dominance that had characterized Baghdad were severely diminished. The trauma of the invasion turned the region inward, fostering a sense of conservatism and a suspicion of the outside world that some historians argue can still be felt today. The Mongols, for their part, moved on. Hulagu had fulfilled his mandate. He had broken the back of the Islamic world. He eventually established the Ilkhanate, a Mongol dynasty that would rule Persia and Iraq for a century, eventually converting to Islam themselves and rebuilding some of what they had destroyed. But they could not rebuild the books. They could not resurrect the scholars. They could not undo the psychological scar left by the image of the caliph, the supreme leader of the faithful, being trampled into the mud like common refuse. When we reflect on what the Mongols did to Baghdad's royal family, we are looking at a collision of two worldviews. On one side, a sedentary, sophisticated civilization that believed in the sanctity of tradition, the power of wealth, and the divine right of kings. On the other, a nomadic, martial meritocracy that respected only strength and saw mercy as a weakness. The caliph's fate was worse than death because it stripped him of every layer of his identity before the end came. He was stripped of his army, his city, his wealth, his family, his dignity, and finally, his humanity. He was forced to witness the apocalypse he had failed to prevent, and then he was extinguished in a manner that denied him even the tragedy of a martyr's death. The silence that fell over Baghdad after the Mongol army departed was the silence of a graveyard. The irrigation canals, the lifeblood of Mesopotamia, were destroyed, turning fertile farmland into desert. The population was decimated. The city of peace had become a city of ghosts. It would take centuries for Baghdad to recover even a fraction of its former glory. The story of al-Mustasim serves as a grim reminder across the centuries. Civilization is fragile. It is built on agreements, on infrastructure, on the collective belief in order. But when confronted with a force that does not share those beliefs, a force of pure, unbridled violence, the walls can fall with terrifying speed. The carpet in which the caliph died is a metaphor for the blindness of the elite. Wrapped in the comforts of his station, insulated from the harsh realities of the world, he could not see the hooves approaching until they were already upon him. The Mongols did not just kill a king, they demonstrated the ultimate impermanence of human power. They showed that, without the strength to defend it, culture, history, and lineage are nothing more than dust waiting to be scattered by the wind. In the end, the fate of the Abbasid royal family remains one of history's darkest chapters, a testament to the cruelty that men are capable of when the restraints of shared humanity are cast aside in the name of conquest. It was a reckoning that reset the clock of civilization, a tragedy of such magnitude that the world is, in some ways, still recovering from the loss. The river ran black with ink, the river ran red with blood, and the last caliph of Baghdad lay crushed in the dark, a silent witness to the death of his world.